Again, talking about the decisions that we're going to make after this conference as we go back to our respective communities. Understand that each decision has to be made in context of a larger plan, that the neighborhoods that you're going to make these decisions in do interact and interplay off of one another. Not all neighborhoods are created equal. That's the other thing, that some neighborhoods, there's a very strong case to be made about some of these activities because there are other entities there. You can leverage the funds and leverage the opportunities. Other neighborhoods you look at and you have to be very pragmatic and just maybe there is no short-term or even intermediate answer. So the issue of making sure that the precious resources that you have are invested wisely. Don't invest them in a vacuum. Understand that ultimately you're going to have to pull the trigger, but make sure that you do that, understanding what the larger implications are. And while it's politically, comfortable to say, well, all neighborhoods are going to be treated equally, and we're going to initiate and implement these plans in every area of the city, it's not pragmatic. It's actually disingenuous. And our experience is found that the folks and the citizens who are ultimately a critical part of this appreciate that honesty. Initially it caused some tense times and still does in the city of Youngstown as we talk about this. Not that we ultimately don't want to see the entire city do well, but we have to be very pragmatic and honest about what we can do when with the resources that are available. Many of you have heard of this, that the fixing the broken windows theory, stopping the spread of blight and decay, and a lot of what is being discussed at this conference does just that. When you talk about deconstruction, when you talk about adaptive reuse, and it also becomes contagious because the neighbors and the other folks in that neighborhood, they start feeling better about themselves and better about their environment. They start taking that responsibility. And we've seen that be successful. Now, again, there's still lots of places in Youngstown where this is yet to take place, but we've seen that success. Again, this just goes to we call it a call to action. Here it's been referred to as act and implement, making sure that there is that action plan, making sure that there is that accountability, making sure that when there are successes, you celebrate that success. Well, this goes to the collaboration. Let me take a step back. We've seen a significant increase in the collaborative efforts that are being undertaken in the city of Youngstown. Even 5 or 8 years ago, it was basically, we're going to sit and wait for City Hall to figure it out. And that just wasn't going to work. City Hall didn't have the resources. City Hall didn't have the expertise. And sometimes City Hall didn't have it on its agenda. Not to say that, my predecessor who hired me and ultimately is largely part of my success here, or my ability to get some of these things done, but sometimes just simply waiting on City Hall, waiting on the politics to congeal and come together just isn't real productive, and that had become too pervasive in the city of Youngstown. There are now more nonprofits, there are now more community groups that are building capacity to take these tasks on. Again, City Hall has a role to play as government, providing resources when and where appropriate, applying regulations or moving regulations when and where appropriate, and sometimes just getting out of the way and cheering and encouraging those that are taking control of them. That talks about leveraging the funds. This oftentimes boils down to resources that are available, and we know that resources have been scarce. Again, I go back to the notion of the change in Washington, D.C. I am hopeful that we will see a renewed focus, a renewed emphasis, investing in our infrastructure. Conferences like this will be well-positioned, in my opinion, well-positioned to take advantage of that. Because when we talk about where this work needs to be done, it is in our core cities, it is in our core neighborhoods. So we're, again, in my opinion, ahead of the curve, because as Washington figures that out and hopefully as those funds begin to flow, the recipients will be folks such as yourselves and agencies and organizations represented here who already have the experience in doing that type of work. And again, I talked about celebrating those successes because it's extremely important that whether it's a small success, and I have seen this, and sometimes I think, well, this is insignificant, and I don't want to appear that we've sort of fixed the problems of Youngstown, and you hear those cynics and those critics, well, yeah, you got this, but what about this house falling apart? What about this neighborhood? Why are you guys over there happy? But it's important, and it builds that credibility, it builds that positive feeling. And even the cynics and the critics who we invited in to be a part of this process, it's interesting. Before they just blew the process off and they didn't want to hear it. But even now, when they're being critical, at least they're being critical within the confines of the plan. And I find that interesting. You know, they're still criticizing us and banging us on our heads, but they're doing it speaking the Youngstown 2010 language. So I sort of chuckle. They don't even recognize it. Instead of just saying, oh, this stuff will never work. Well, hey, if you guys have got that plan, why are you doing X, Y, Z? Well, hey, the plan says this. Tell me where you're going to get this thing done. That's a good thing, especially in a city like Youngstown. And again, I appreciate the fact of being invited here, because when you talk about recycling the city, restoring the center, and acting and initiating, those things are squarely and consistently with what we're doing in Youngstown, Ohio. And it's encouraging to me, because this does get extremely frustrating at times, as I'm sure we can all tell stories of being frustrated and discouraged. But when I'm able to come to conferences like this and learn and take things back, I didn't come here to necessarily reveal anything that you don't already know, but just to share some of what's going on in a smaller city like Youngstown, Ohio, but also to take back with me some of the valuable lessons and innovative things that are being done here. So with that, again, you know, I just go back to the final quote of the President Kennedy when he said, "This takes a long time. You know, it won't be finished very quickly, but we absolutely have already begun and must continue to move this forward." So thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions or comments or opinions. I appreciate the invitation.
The question that I have is, I had read a little bit about this controversy that kind of surrounds your administration and this definition of a shrinking city, and you know, this idea that there are some neighborhoods which might no longer exist. And in Buffalo, the mentality is to bulldoze the east side, and it's low income, scattered, and so I'm wondering, like, is there a way that you can describe how the choice of neighborhoods is made?
Sure, and that's, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's been sort of taken out of context. There's not really a lot of controversy surrounding that, because we haven't gotten to that point yet. We haven't decided that this neighborhood is no longer going to exist, just explicitly coming to that point. What we have done is there are neighborhoods that have become so depopulated that it's conceivable that at some point there's just not going to be anybody left there. We're not forcing anybody out, but we have tried to offer incentives, financial incentives, to say, you know what, instead of us spending $50,000 to rehabilitate your home that once we walk away is still only going to be worth $10,000, can we put you in a better situation in a more densely populated area of the city? You know, if you don't have a mortgage now, you're not going to have a mortgage then. You got a house worth X now, it's going to be worth more somewhere else. But we haven't forced anybody out. What we have almost arrived at is there's a couple of neighborhoods that have become very much depopulated. There's a businessman who owns several dozen acres, and he has a business that takes earth-moving equipment. He modifies it to dismantle steel mills and very large buildings. He's actually come to the city and said, he started buying up these houses, and he's come to the city and said, you know what, he's not forcing anybody out, but he's offering people incentives, and when they take it, he acquires the property. He has said that once that neighborhood empties out, would the city be willing to vacate those streets and those utilities and turn that particular neighborhood over to him? And we've said absolutely yes. So there hasn't been controversy, because we're not yet, because we're not pushing anybody out, but we're offering financial incentives. Whether or not we ultimately bulldoze an entire former neighborhood remains to be seen. Certainly not if people are living there. We're still going to provide the services. Some cities have taken a more aggressive approach to this, but at this point, we're not there yet. We're mapping these things out, and at least we're having the discussion. Heretofore, it was even taboo to have that discussion, but we're having the discussion. So also, as it relates to the selection of the neighborhoods, we try to be very pragmatic as to, are there other entities there that are anchor institutions or anchor organizations? Is it conceivable that this neighborhood might have to take on a different connotation? It was once primarily residential, now it might be industrial or something of that. So we're still trying to work our way through that.